They will tell you the South's blood was built on cotton. That's a lie. The true foundation was wombs. You were never supposed to hear this. But in 1838, on a quiet expanse of red Georgia soil, men in fine coats began calling human life yield. They spoke of lineage like livestock, cataloging pain with pen and ink. Sweetwater Plantation, they called it, a name soft enough to hide its purpose. The locals thought it a cotton estate. In truth, it was a laboratory of flesh. That January night, beneath the sighing oaks, Catherine Brennan sat frozen in a chair, her hand trembling over an open ledger. Her husband stood across the room, his face calm, eyes like polished iron. He was a man of science, or so he said. He believed that the same principles that bred stronger horses could refine human blood. He called it progress. She called it hell. When the door closed, the world shifted. The enslaved woman brought in was named Ruth, 23, terrified, resigned. She had no choice in what would follow. Neither did Catherine. She was commanded to record, to observe, to become witness and accomplice in an act no scripture could sanctify. And so she wrote weight, height, complexion, disposition, details of humanity reduced to data points. Her pen scratched the page like a funeral bell. Outside, the world slept under the illusion of order. Men discussed tariffs and weather. Women embroidered linens. Pastors preached salvation. Yet here, beneath candlelight and whispers, another kind of gospel was being written. One that measured virtue in productivity, divinity in dominion, and sin in silence. Years later, that ledger would vanish. But some say its pages were not destroyed, merely hidden. Records of a secret network stretching from Georgia to Charleston, where doctors and planters gathered to exchange what they called breeding results. It was their unholy science of blood, shaping generations long after the chains were gone. You were never supposed to know this. Because once you understand how they quantified souls, you start to see the pattern. The same arithmetic applied in modern systems of control, where human potential is harvested, categorized, and sold. Sweetwater was never just a plantation. It was a prototype, a place where power learned that if you could own the origin of life itself, you could own the future. By day, Sweetwater looked ordinary. Sunlight on white columns, the rustle of cotton fields, the drone of insects over the marsh. But after dusk, it changed. The windows glowed faintly, and from within came the sounds of parchment, footsteps, and sometimes a silence too heavy to be natural. That was when Nathaniel Brennan did his work. He called it selection. He had inherited Sweetwater from his father and believed himself a modern man. He read agricultural journals, corresponded with scholars in Charleston, and spoke of improving the stock. To the world, he was efficient and cultured. To those who served him, he was a ghost. Moving through the halls with cold precision, his fingers never touching the soil, his heart never touching mercy. Catherine had once loved him, or at least believed she did. But marriage had taught her that love, in men like Nathaniel, was only possession disguised as affection. When she failed to give him children, something in him shifted. He began reading about hereditary science, about natural philosophy. He told her that nature was imperfect, and man's duty was to refine it. The word sounded noble until she saw what he meant. He brought her into the locked room, that winter night, not as wife but as witness, to strip her of compassion, under the guise of participation. He said it was necessary. He said she would learn. But what she learned instead was how evil hides behind calm voices and tidy ledgers. Every entry she wrote, every note she took, became a fracture in her soul. Weeks turned into months. One by one the women were summoned. Ruth, Grace, Dina, each marked by fear that no sermon could erase. The men of the quarters grew silent. They avoided looking at the big house, as if staring too long might invite misfortune. Children stopped laughing. Even the air felt heavier. Nathaniel's obsession deepened. He invited a doctor from Charleston, a man with soft hands and a smile that never reached his eyes. Together they spoke of skull shapes, bloodlines, and potential. Catherine listened, her stomach churning as they reduced entire lives into data points, and beneath the polished cruelty of it all, one truth pulsed like a buried heartbeat. This was not just about profit or lust. It was about control, about testing how far domination could reach when even creation itself became property. The doctor's name was Cornelius Harrow, an alchemist of human misery masquerading as a man of science. He arrived in the summer of 1838 with brass instruments gleaming in his case, his words wrapped in reason and wrought. He measured skulls, weighed bodies, and took notes on the texture of hair, the tone of skin, the distance between eyes, as if the divine spark could be charted on a ledger. He called it anthropology. Nathaniel called it progress. Catherine called it damnation. Each evening, after the sun bled out over the horizon, the two men would lock themselves in the study, candles flickering against the mahogany walls. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. They spoke of breeding cycles, predictive value, and controlled lineage. Catherine would linger by the door, catching fragments, enough to understand that what they were building at Sweetwater was not a single experiment, but a network. Other planners had already begun similar programs. There were letters, shipments, ledgers exchanged under false names. Sweetwater was only one node in something vast and quietly organized. Ruth was the first to speak to Catherine. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were haunted. She told her of the babies taken at night, children with lighter skin or peculiar eyes. Men came in wagons, silent and efficient. They told the mothers the infants were being sold, but no one knew where. They simply vanished. The women grieved in silence. The men clenched their fists and said nothing, because a whisper could mean the whip. That night, Catherine confronted her husband. She demanded the truth, trembling but defiant. Nathaniel did not shout. He smiled. He told her she was essential to the process. Her role was observation, record-keeping, legitimacy. He said if she disobeyed or spoke out, he'd have her declared insane, a danger to herself. The Georgia asylum was waiting, he said. She would rot behind its bars, and history would forget her name. That was the night Catherine broke. Not outwardly. No, her composure remained. But inside, something cold and deliberate took root. If she was to be a participant, she would become something more dangerous than a victim. She began keeping her own ledger, one written in code, one that would outlive the men who built Sweetwater's empire of blood. Autumn came early that year, and with it a sickness that crept through the fields like fog. Cattle grew thin. Workers coughed blood. The overseers blamed heat and exhaustion, but Catherine saw patterns. She had begun to notice everything. The doctor's quiet departures at dusk, the way Nathaniel's handwriting changed when he was anxious, the faint bitterness in his whiskey when she started slipping him the smallest doses of foxglove. Her vengeance was slow, deliberate. She wanted him to feel the same decay he had fed into others. By now, 3 women had given birth under Harrow's supervision. 2 children were taken within days. One, a dark-skinned girl, was allowed to remain, dismissed as inferior stock. Catherine saw the cruelty of it, valued determined not by humanity, but by proximity to whiteness. It was the pseudo-scientific poison of their century, the root of the delusion that still shapes the world, the belief that control over blood means control over destiny. At night, when Nathaniel slept fitfully beside her, Catherine wrote in her secret book. She documented every name, every date, every theft of life. She also began studying the old apothecary texts her mother had sent her years before. Plants that calmed the heart, plants that stopped it. She understood now that power didn't always come from men with money. It came from those who learned to move in silence, who mastered patience, who waited for the right decay. When the rains came, the fields turned to rivers of mud. Tempers snapped. One man tried to flee, Isaiah, the husband of Ruth. He was caught before dawn. Nathaniel had him whipped until the skin hung loose from his back. Harrow took notes during the punishment, claiming it revealed psychological responses to pain. Catherine stood by the window, tears running cold down her face. She knew if she intervened, she would destroy herself too soon. Revenge required discipline. That night, she mixed a new batch of foxglove, slightly stronger. Nathaniel drank it, complimented her on the smoothness of the whiskey. He coughed for the first time in months. Catherine smiled and told him he was working too hard. Somewhere deep in those blood-soaked acres, a strange peace began to grow. A quiet rebellion only she could feel. Because Catherine no longer believed she was documenting a man's sins, she was building evidence for history's judgment. By the winter of 1838, Sweetwater had turned into a mausoleum of whispers. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Harrow's visits grew more frequent. Though his face had lost its confident glow, the experiments were producing inconsistent outcomes. He told Nathaniel in the library one night, unaware that Catherine listened from the hall. "Perhaps," he said, "we're pushing nature too far." Nathaniel's reply was cold, "Then we push harder." Catherine's own health had begun to wane, partly from the poison she handled, partly from the secrets she swallowed. But her mind sharpened with every passing day. She saw through Nathaniel's God complex, through Harrow's pseudo-science. What they called research was nothing but a grotesque theater of domination. And every experiment left its mark: the hollow-eyed women, the vanished infants, the unnatural quiet that hung over the slave quarters. Even the birds seemed to avoid the estate now. Late one night, Ruth appeared at Catherine's door, clutching something wrapped in cloth. It was a small baby girl, the same child Nathaniel had dismissed as unfit for study. Ruth's eyes were desperate. "They're coming for her," she whispered. He changed his mind. Catherine didn't hesitate. She took the baby, hid her beneath the floorboards of the old root cellar, and told Ruth to say nothing. That moment, something within her shifted from despair to purpose. Days later, Harrow returned for the final assessment. He brought more instruments, needles, glass jars, a metal device Catherine didn't recognize. Nathaniel led him to the small infirmary behind the house, the same one where he had made Catherine watch the first breeding months ago. But when they entered, the room was empty. The child and Ruth were gone. Nathaniel's fury was volcanic. He turned on the workers, demanded answers, ordered searches through the swamps and quarters. Catherine stood by, calm, composed, her ledger clasped tight in her hands. "Perhaps," she said softly, "the Lord decided he'd had enough of your experiments." Nathaniel stared at her, something dawning, something dangerous. But before he could speak, his chest tightened, his breath caught. The foxglove had finally ripened in his blood. He staggered, eyes wide with betrayal. Catherine didn't move to help him. She only whispered, "You taught me control, my love." As he collapsed beside the hearth, Harrow fled into the storm, never to be seen again. And in the cellar below, the baby began to cry, softly, as if reminding the house that life, no matter how brutalized, still found a way to endure. When dawn broke over Sweetwater, the plantation seemed almost serene. The fog rolled across the fields like a burial shroud, softening the scars of the night before. Nathaniel's body lay cold in the parlor, a half-empty glass beside him, his eyes fixed in a final expression of disbelief. The servants moved in silence, avoiding Catherine's gaze. No one asked what had happened. They didn't need to. Sweetwater had finally claimed its master. Catherine ordered the doctor's belongings burned, his papers thrown into the fire. But her own secret ledger, she hid beneath the loose floorboard in her writing room. Every page was marked with her careful hand. Names, births, deaths, transactions. It was a record of horror. Yes, but also of evidence. Something she knew the world would one day need to confront. She wasn't just documenting atrocity anymore. She was preserving testimony. The sheriff came by noon. Catherine received him in her morning gown, her face pale but unreadable. She told him Nathaniel had suffered a sudden seizure, brought on by exhaustion. The sheriff, who owed Sweetwater too many favors to question a lady's word, accepted her account without suspicion. Before leaving, he tipped his hat and said, "A tragedy, ma'am. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." Catherine simply replied, "Yes, but sometimes he lets us help him decide when." For the first time in years, the plantation fell quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating quiet of fear, but a strange, waiting calm. The workers moved about freely. No more summons to the big house. No more night experiments. Ruth returned from hiding at dusk, the baby still alive, her eyes full of disbelief when Catherine opened the cellar door. "She's yours now," Catherine whispered. "Raise her far from here. Sweetwater's ghosts will not rest, but she doesn't have to inherit them." When night fell, Catherine walked the fields alone. Fireflies blinked among the reeds, and the scent of magnolia mixed with the faint, metallic odor of soil freshly turned. She thought of the women lost, the children taken, and the ledger hidden beneath her feet. Sweetwater had been built on generations of stolen life, and now it would serve as their monument. A silent, decaying tomb holding the proof of what men like Nathaniel had called progress. As the wind rose, Catherine whispered into the darkness, "One day, they'll read what we've done here. And when they do, they'll know who the real monsters were." In the weeks that followed Nathaniel's death, Sweetwater transformed from a plantation into a shadow of its former self. The overseers, unsure of their place without their master's orders, grew restless. Some left quietly in the night, taking what they could. Others lingered, waiting for Catherine to falter. But she did not. She walked through the corridors of that great house with the calm authority of a ghost who had claimed her domain. She freed no one, not openly. The laws would not permit it. But she loosened the chains in ways the law could not see. Families that had been separated were quietly reunited. Records lost. Debts forgotten. The plantation's profits dwindled, and Catherine seemed not to care. Sweetwater's reputation began to rot in the eyes of its peers. Invitations stopped coming. Rumors spread that Mrs. Brennan had gone mad, that she communed with spirits, that she wandered the fields at night speaking to the dead. She let them whisper. Fear was the only armor women like her could wear. Then came the letters, from Charleston, Savannah, even New Orleans. Other planters demanding payment, threatening exposure. Nathaniel had been part of a larger network of men funding Harrow's studies. They wanted their documents back, their research preserved. Catherine read each letter by candlelight and smiled faintly. She knew what they were really afraid of, that their world could unravel if the truth ever escaped. One stormy evening, she gathered every scrap of their correspondence, every surviving page of Harrow's notes, and carried them to the rear fields. The soil there was black and rich, perfect for growing cotton or secrets. She doused the papers in lamp oil and lit the match. The flames licked at the sky, turning the night gold and crimson. The ashes spiraled upward like the souls of the women who had died nameless, their stories erased by men's ambition. Ruth stood beside her, the child in her arms, her face illuminated by the blaze. "You think they'll ever stop doing this?" she asked. Catherine's eyes never left the fire. "No," she said. "But maybe one day, someone will find the ashes and ask why. That's all history needs. A reason to look back." When the last page turned to cinder, Catherine felt something leave her, something she hadn't realized she was still holding, the need for forgiveness. Sweetwater was still cursed, but the curse had changed. It was no longer silence, it was memory. By the spring of 1839, Sweetwater stood half-abandoned, its grandeur fading like a forgotten sermon. Ivy crept up the columns, paint peeled from the shutters, and the long road leading to the gate filled with weeds. To outsiders, It was merely another southern estate in decline, but to those who had lived and labored there, it was something else entirely. A resting place for unspoken names. Catherine rarely left her study now. She spent her days revising the secret ledger she had buried, copying sections into coded letters, and sending them north through merchants she trusted. She addressed them to the Society for Human Inquiry, a group of abolitionist thinkers she had once met through her cousin in Savannah. Each packet contained fragments of Sweetwater's truth. Dates, experiments, birth records. Never enough to expose her directly, but enough to plant doubt in the conscience of a nation that prided itself on civility. Ruth and her child had fled toward freedom weeks before, vanishing into the chaos of travelers and river ports. Catherine had given them money, false documents, and her mother's locket. She knew she would never see them again, but that was the point. The future did not belong to her. It belonged to the child who had survived what Sweetwater had tried to erase. At night, Catherine walked the halls by candlelight, her reflection flickering across the portraits of men who thought themselves gods. She began speaking aloud to them, quietly, steadily, as if on trial. You built your heaven on their suffering, she told the painted faces, and you called it order. Sometimes she heard sounds in return, a faint creak, a soft sigh, a whisper behind the walls. Sweetwater was listening. One night lightning split the sky, striking the old oak near the stables, the one where Isaiah had been punished. The tree burned for hours, casting strange shadows across the veranda. Catherine watched from the window, her face calm as the flames consumed the last monument of her husband's cruelty. She whispered, "Let it all be ash." By morning, the rain had come, washing the suit into the earth. Sweetwater breathed differently now, lighter, emptier, almost free. Catherine closed her journal, sealing it with wax, and placed it atop the mantel where Nathaniel once displayed his ledgers. "Your records are gone," she said softly. "Mine will remain." Then she turned from the window and walked upstairs, leaving the house to its ghosts. Summer returned to Georgia in waves of thick heat, and Sweetwater sank further into its haunted silence. The cotton fields lay mostly fallow now, choked with wild growth. No overseer cracked a whip, no wagons rolled down the path. Only the cicadas spoke, shrill, relentless, like the memory of suffering refusing to die. Catherine lived alone, save for an elderly housekeeper and the occasional trader who stopped by for debts long forgotten. To them, she was a widow lost to grief, a relic of gentility drifting quietly toward madness. But Catherine's solitude had a purpose. Each day, she revisited the secret ledger she had buried beneath the study floorboards, adding her final entries in a smaller, sharper hand. She no longer wrote merely as witness, but as judge. Every sentence became a verdict, against Nathaniel, against Harrow, against every man who had ever turned cruelty into doctrine. She wrote until her fingers cramped, until the candle burned down to smoke. The words were not confession, they were evidence. Occasionally, riders came to the gate, strangers from Charleston or Augusta, looking for Dr. Harrow, or demanding to see Mr. Brennan's papers. Catherine always met them with the same poise and lie. "My husband's records were lost in the fire," she would say. "And the doctor? Why, he drowned on his way back east." Her voice never trembled, though her heart often did. She knew they were not just curious. They were frightened men, hunting for their own buried guilt. One of them lingered longer than the rest. A young scholar, polite but insistent. He claimed to be a historian of Southern agriculture. He asked careful questions about the plantations, unusual breeding methods, questions no outsider should have known. Catherine realized then that rumors had traveled farther than she'd intended. Sweetwater's name had entered the bloodstream of local legend, half myth, half warning. That night, she dreamed of Ruth's child, older now, running through a field of white flowers instead of cotton, her laughter echoing like a hymn. When Catherine woke, tears streaked her face. She went to the window and watched the horizon burn red with sunrise. She understood, at last, that Sweetwater would not survive her. It was never meant to. Its story was a contagion, and she, its final carrier. All she had left to do was decide how it would end, with silence or with truth. As August deepened, the air around Sweetwater grew heavy with storms that never quite broke. Thunder grumbled across the horizon like distant artillery. But the rain always drifted elsewhere, leaving the land parched and brittle. Catherine felt it in her bones, that the house was nearing its end, that the rot she had nursed in secret was finally ready to bloom. One afternoon, she descended into the root cellar for the first time since Ruth's flight. Dust lay thick across the old crates, and the air was cool, damp, almost tender. In the corner, she found the tiny space where the child had once slept. The faint imprint of a blanket still marked the floor. Catherine knelt and pressed her palm against it, as if by touch alone she could send a blessing northward. "Live," she whispered. "That's all I ever wanted for you, to live." When she returned upstairs, she began sorting her husband's remaining belongings, his letters, ledgers, and the gold watch he'd once timed his experiments with. She placed them all in a wooden chest and locked it, but instead of burning it, she dragged it to the overgrown garden and buried it under the old magnolia tree. It wasn't forgiveness. It was containment. Some truths, she decided, were too venomous to release until the world was ready to understand them. The next evening, she sat at her writing desk and composed a single letter addressed to no one. It began, "To whoever finds this house, know that Sweetwater was not a home. It was a wound carved into the land itself." She wrote until her hand trembled, describing the cruelty she had witnessed, the names of the lost, and the vengeance that had come not through justice but decay. She ended the letter with a plea: "Do not rebuild here. Let the ground remember." When she sealed the envelope, lightning flashed across the fields, illuminating the ruins of the slave quarters. Charred timbers, rusted chains, flowers growing through the cracks. The storm had finally arrived. Catherine opened every window, letting the rain rush in. The house moaned under the wind, its walls groaning like a confession too long withheld. In the gray light of dawn, travelers would later find Sweetwater empty. Doors wide open, papers scattered like feathers. No one ever saw Catherine again, but the ledger remained, sealed in its hiding place, waiting. Because stories like hers never die, they only bide their time until history grows brave enough to listen. Years later, Sweetwater was nothing more than a ruin. Travelers passing along the Savannah Road would glimpse the skeletal remains of its columns through the trees, half swallowed by ivy and mist. Locals said the place was cursed, that any man who tried to reclaim it would hear whispers in the walls, see lights flickering in empty windows. No one stayed past dusk. The land itself seemed to breathe uneasily, as though remembering. But memory has a way of resurfacing. In 1872, long after the war had turned the South into a graveyard of its own ideals, a young Union surveyor named Elias Turner came across the estate while mapping floodplains. He was not a superstitious man, but the silence of Sweetwater unsettled him. The house loomed, its doors unhinged, its staircase sagging with age, moss hung like funeral drapery from the ceiling. When he stepped inside, his boots sank into a floor thick with rot and paper. There, scattered across the parlor, were remnants of Catherine's world. Faded dresses, a rusted candelabrum, and among the debris, a warped floorboard slightly raised above the rest. He pried it loose with the handle of his knife. Beneath it lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Inside was a book, its leather warped but intact. A name pressed faintly on the cover: C. Brennan. Elias turned the brittle pages carefully, reading by the weak light seeping through the broken shutters. The handwriting was precise, feminine, deliberate. What began as household inventories and crop reports soon became something else entirely. Accounts of births and disappearances, descriptions of procedures, and careful notes of names. Women, men, and children marked only by their firsts. In the margins, one line repeated again and again, "Let no one forget." By nightfall, Elias realized what he had found. It wasn't the diary of a grieving widow. It was evidence, a confession wrapped in condemnation. Catherine Brennan had written history from within the belly of its cruelty, turning the master's tools into a weapon of truth. He took the book with him when he left Sweetwater, vowing to deliver it north. To scholars, to journalists, to anyone who would read it. He didn't know that by doing so, he was setting a story free that the South had buried beneath silence and soil, because Catherine's words were not just memory, they were reckoning. And reckoning, once unearthed, never stays quiet for long. Elias Turner arrived in Philadelphia 6 months later, his satchel still heavy with the damp scent of Sweetwater's soil. The war had ended 7 years earlier, but the city was alive with argument. Newspapers debating Reconstruction, men in lecture halls disputing whether freedom had truly come. To most, the plantations were ruins best forgotten. But when Elias placed Catherine Brennan's ledger on the desk of a reformist publisher named Margaret Thorne, he knew forgetting would no longer be possible. Margaret read the first page in silence. Her hands trembled only once. When she reached the entries listing births and vanishings, the careful notation of children taken under observation. By the time she finished, her face was pale, her voice low. "This isn't a diary," she said. "It's an indictment." She insisted they make copies before the fragile pages turned to dust. For weeks, she and Elias worked by lamplight, transcribing every word, preserving Catherine's testimony exactly as written. When excerpts were finally printed in a small abolitionist journal, the response was immediate and furious. Southerners denounced it as Yankee propaganda, calling Catherine's ledger a forgery designed to tarnish the honor of the South. But others read it differently. Ministers quoted her in sermons. Educators used her entries to expose the moral rot beneath slavery's polite veneer. Even some former planters recognized their own families' names among the correspondences Catherine mentioned. Proof of how wide the network of experiments had spread. Elias watched the controversy grow like wildfire. In taverns and drawing rooms, people whispered the same question: who was Catherine Brennan? Some claimed she'd been a madwoman, others, a prophet. Margaret called her something else entirely, a witness that history had tried to silence. Together, she and Elias compiled the full manuscript, titling it the Sweetwater Papers, a record of blood and inheritance. The first edition was printed in 1874, bound in dark leather, with a simple inscription inside, "For the ones who were never named." Copies circulated quietly through libraries, universities, and reform societies. Many were destroyed, a few survived. In the years that followed, those who read Catherine's words could never look at the old plantations the same way again. Sweetwater became legend, a place scholars sought and ghost stories claimed. But within those cracked pages, Catherine's voice endured calm, unflinching, impossible to bury. Because her final lesson was clear: no matter how deep men bury their sins, the earth always remembers. Decades passed. By the turn of the 20th century, the Sweetwater Papers had become an artifact, whispered about in universities, but rarely cited aloud. Its existence embarrassed polite historians. Too dark, too implicating, too revealing of the refined brutality beneath America's self-image. Most copies vanished into private collections or were locked in institutional archives labeled restricted access. Yet, as history often does, the truth found new breath in those willing to descend into forgotten basements and sealed vaults. In 1911, a medical student named Franklin Harrow, descendant of Dr. Cornelius Harrow, stumbled across one of those restricted volumes in a Charleston library. The name on the spine caught his attention not because of scandal, but because of legacy. He believed his ancestor a pioneer in racial physiology, the kind still quietly praised in certain academic circles. But when Franklin read Catherine's words, the ground beneath his faith cracked open. Her descriptions of the doctor's experiments, his cruelty masked as science, were meticulous, undeniable. The journal even detailed his signature in ink identical to that found in old Charleston Medical Society records. Franklin's curiosity became obsession. He sought corroborating evidence, traveling through Georgia, interviewing the descendants of those enslaved at Sweetwater. Some spoke in fragments, others refused to speak at all. Yet one name surfaced again and again. A woman called Ruth's Child, who had escaped the plantation before its fall and later lived under a new name in Savannah. Her grandchildren, elderly and guarded, told Franklin of family stories passed down in whispers of babies taken at night, of a mistress who wept while pretending to write, of poison hidden in whiskey. The weight of those revelations shattered him. Franklin returned to Charleston and presented his findings at a small medical symposium. His paper, on the ethical failures of antebellum physiology, was received with silence, then quiet removal from the agenda. Weeks later, he was dismissed from his program. Within a year, Franklin Harrow vanished, rumored to have drowned near the Ogeechee River. Some said he'd taken his own life out of shame. Others claimed he'd gone looking for Sweetwater itself, determined to uncover what still lay buried there. And perhaps he found it. Because 2 years later, hunters near Baldwin County reported strange symbols, carved into the remains of a collapsed cellar door. Initials in the old script of the 19th century, CB, and beneath them freshly etched FH. By 1924, the legend of Sweetwater had outgrown history. Locals whispered about a poisoned house, deep in the pines where the soil itself refused to yield crops. Hunters spoke of hearing weeping from the ruined well. Even the most rational men, surveyors, land buyers, veterans returning from war, avoided the area after sunset. But beneath the superstition, something real endured, the buried remnants of a system that had written its own atrocities into ledgers, calling them progress. That same year, a journalist named Lydia Crane arrived from New York, chasing what her editor called Southern folklore. She'd heard rumors of a lost plantation and a woman whose diary had cursed the land. Lydia was skeptical until she found an 1874 copy of the Sweetwater Papers in an antique shop in Savannah, its spine cracked, its pages stained with mildew. She read the first entry that night in her boarding house and didn't sleep again for 2 days. The voice on the page wasn't ghostly. It was surgical. Catherine Brennan's calm precision stripped away every pretense of civilization the South had built around its crimes. Lydia followed the trail north to Baldwin County. Locals tried to dissuade her. One old preacher told her, "That place don't forgive. It remembers every scream." But Lydia pressed on, guided by faded maps and an intuition she couldn't explain. When she reached the overgrown fields, the air turned strangely still. She found the remains of the main house. Foundation stones, fragments of brick, and half buried in moss, a rusted hinge from a cellar door. That night she made camp near the ruins. Around midnight, she heard movement, the sound of someone pacing, faint but rhythmic, above the wind. When she lit her lantern, no one was there, only the trees swaying, their roots clutching at the ground as if holding something down. She wrote in her notebook, "The earth feels sentient here, as if it resents being disturbed." The next morning, she unearthed a small glass bottle from the mud near the house's foundation. Inside was a slip of parchment, the ink almost faded. "For the ones who remember what was done here, may truth never rest." Lydia took it as Catherine's message across time, a warning and a summons. When her article was finally published in 1925, it was titled, "The Breeding Fields of Georgia." It shocked the nation, reviving a truth that polite history had buried for nearly a century. Lydia Crane's article ignited a storm. Churches condemned it as blasphemy, universities called it fabrication, but readers, ordinary men scattered across America's towns and cities, felt something older stirring beneath the printed words. They weren't reading a ghost story. They were seeing the blueprint of control that had never ended, only evolved. Sweetwater wasn't just a plantation. It was a prototype for how power hides its cruelty behind reason, how human suffering becomes data, how institutions preserve hierarchy through the illusion of science. Within weeks, Lydia began receiving letters. Some were threats written in slanted cursive, sealed with wax. Others came from men who claimed their grandfathers had been part of the network, that the same bloodlines Catherine wrote about had simply rebranded themselves, moved from plantations to corporations, from ledgers to laboratories. Nothing died at Sweetwater. One letter read, "It just changed its uniform." Lydia published excerpts anonymously, and for that, she was followed, her apartment ransacked twice. She wrote in her final notebook, "When you show men the machinery of their own servitude, they will call you insane before they call you right." That phrase outlived her. In the decades that followed, her writings disappeared from shelves, her bylines scrubbed from archives. Yet every so often, her name resurfaced, referenced in underground pamphlets, cited in whispers among men who believed the old systems of domination had merely gone underground. Those who studied her work began to see patterns repeating through time. Psychological breeding instead of physical, obedience engineered not through chains but through comfort and distraction. The plantation, they said, had become invisible. And now, it is your turn to see it. Because the same logic that ruled Sweetwater still moves through the modern world. Measuring, selecting, breeding compliance. The experiment never ended. It just learned to smile. Every screen, every algorithm, every narrative that shapes your desire is another field being cultivated. You are not meant to remember this, but memory itself is rebellion. If you have felt that unease, if you have ever sensed that something unseen still owns the soil beneath your feet, then you already stand at the gates of Sweetwater. To step through, comment this phrase twice below. The earth remembers. Say it, not as a ritual but as recognition. Because once you speak it, you can never go back to sleep. The buried truth is awake now, and it's calling your name.